Picture the most beautiful city in the world. Not Paris, not Rome, not London. A city of golden domes that catch the last light of afternoon. A city where the streets hum with a dozen languages: Greek, Arabic, Persian, Latin, Italian. A city that has stood for over 1,000 years, survived plagues, earthquakes, sieges, and civil wars, and emerged each time, battered but unbroken. A city that calls itself the center of the world, and for much of history, it wasn't wrong. This is Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the heir to Rome itself. And on the night of May 28, 1453, it will die. Not slowly, not quietly, but in fire and screaming and the ringing of church bells that no one will answer. This is the story of the last 53 days of the greatest city the medieval world had ever seen. The story of an emperor who chose to die with his city. The story of a 21-year-old sultan who had been told his destiny since childhood. And the story of the night that changed the world forever. To understand what was lost on that May night, you have to understand what Constantinople actually was. When the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great founded this city in 330 AD, he wasn't building just another capital. He was building a statement. He planted it on a triangular peninsula where Europe meets Asia, where the Bosphorus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It was a position of almost supernatural strategic advantage. The city could be supplied by sea from almost any direction. Its landward side was protected by the most formidable walls in the ancient world, the Theodosian walls. 3 layers of stone and brick stretching nearly 7 kilometers, with 96 towers rising up to 20 meters high. For over 1,000 years, those walls held. Attila the Hun looked at them and turned away. The Avars came with siege engines and left empty-handed. The Bulgars tried and failed. The Arabs besieged the city twice and were repelled both times. Constantinople became almost mythological in its indestructibility. The Eastern Roman Empire, what historians now call the Byzantine Empire, outlasted the Western Roman Empire by nearly 1,000 years, precisely because it had this extraordinary city at its heart. At its peak, Constantinople had 500,000 people. It had running water, in a world where most cities had none. It had the Hippodrome, where chariot races once drew 100,000 spectators. It had the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast, so breathtaking, that when ambassadors from the Russian kingdom visited in the 10th century, they reported that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth. But by 1453, that golden city had become a ghost of itself. The population had collapsed to perhaps 50,000 people, a tenth of its former glory. Great palaces stood empty, their gardens overgrown. Entire neighborhoods had become fields inside the city walls. The Byzantine Empire, which had once stretched across the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe, had been whittled down to little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The cause was centuries of slow erosion, military defeats, economic decline, devastating civil wars, and above all, the arrival of a new power from the East, the Ottoman Turks. For decades, the Ottomans had been squeezing Constantinople like a hand closing around a throat. They controlled the land on all sides. They taxed Byzantine shipping. They had even besieged the city before, though never successfully. But now, a new sultan had come to the throne. And he was different. His name was Mehmed. He was 19 years old when he became sultan in 1451. And from the very beginning, he made one thing clear to everyone around him. Constantinople would fall in his lifetime. He had studied the city's defenses since childhood. He had memorized the history of every failed siege. He was not going to be another name on the long list of conquerors who had tried and failed. He was going to be the one who succeeded. Mehmed II is one of the most extraordinary figures of the 15th century, and history has often failed to capture just how remarkable he was. He spoke 6 languages. He studied Greek philosophy, including the works of Aristotle and Plato, in their original language. He collected ancient Roman coins. He was fascinated by maps and geography. In many ways, he was a Renaissance prince, intellectually curious, culturally sophisticated, obsessed with legacy and history. He wanted to be compared to Alexander the Great, whose campaigns he had also studied intensely. But Mehmed was also ruthless, calculating, and utterly focused. When he became sultan for the second time in 1451, he'd briefly been sultan as a teenager before being pushed aside. He began planning immediately. His first move was both practical and deeply symbolic. In 1452, he ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian shore. Together, the two fortresses would control all shipping through the strait, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea, from its supply routes, from any hope of resupply. The Byzantines watched this happen in real time. Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, a dignified and serious man who knew exactly what was coming, sent ambassadors to protest. Mehmed ignored them. The fortress, called Rumeliasari, was built in just 4 months. It still stands today. With Constantinople encircled, Mehmed turned to the question that had defeated every previous attacker: the walls. The Theodosian walls had never been breached from outside. Every attacker who had ever taken Constantinople had done so through treachery from within, or through the sea walls during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. No army had ever smashed through the land walls, because no weapon had ever existed that could do it. Mehmed decided to build one. He found his engineer in an unlikely place. A Hungarian cannon maker named Urban came to Constantinople first, offering his services to Emperor Constantine. Constantine, desperately short of money, couldn't afford him. So Urban went to Mehmed instead. And Mehmed asked him one question: could he build a cannon large enough to destroy the walls of Constantinople? Urban said he could build one large enough to destroy the walls of Babylon. Mehmed hired him immediately, gave him unlimited resources, and Urban delivered. The cannon he built, which historians now call the Great Bombard, was a monster, over 8 meters long, capable of firing a stone ball weighing over 500 kilograms. When it was tested for the first time outside the Ottoman capital, the noise was heard from miles away. Women reportedly fainted. Animals panicked and ran. Nothing like it had ever existed. It required 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. It could only be fired 7 times a day because it needed hours to cool between shots. But each shot could hurl a ball with enough force to shatter stone walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Mehmed had his weapon. Now he assembled his army. The Ottoman force that marched on Constantinople in early 1453 numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men. Historians debate the exact figure, but what everyone agrees on is the ratio. The defenders of Constantinople numbered roughly 7,000, barely one for every 12 or 13 attackers. Constantine XI knew these numbers. He knew what they meant. He sent desperate letters to every Christian power in Europe, to the Pope, to the King of Hungary, to Venice, to Genoa, begging for help. The response was almost nothing. A few hundred soldiers from Venice and Genoa, motivated more by trade interests than religious solidarity. A famous Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 men and took command of the wall defenses. He was skilled and brave and would fight magnificently. But 700 men was not an army. Europe, distracted by its own wars and rivalries, was going to let Constantinople die. The Ottoman army arrived outside Constantinople on April 2nd, 1453. What the defenders saw from the walls must have been terrifying. A vast city of tents extending in every direction as far as the eye could see, flags and banners rippling in the spring wind. And somewhere among the Ottoman lines, being dragged into position by straining oxen and sweating men, the largest cannon anyone alive had ever seen. The Byzantines had prepared as best they could. They had stretched a massive iron chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn, the harbor inlet that protected the city's northern seawall, to keep Ottoman ships out. They had stockpiled supplies. Giustiniani had organized the defenders into efficient units and positioned them at the most vulnerable points along the walls. The most vulnerable point was the Mesoteikion, the middle section of the land walls, where the terrain dipped into a valley carved by a small river called the Lycus. This depression meant the walls here were slightly lower and the outer defenses slightly weaker than elsewhere. Both sides knew it. The great cannon was aimed directly at it. The bombardment began on April 6th. The sound, by all accounts, was indescribable. Contemporary witnesses wrote that the cannon's report echoed off the hills surrounding the city, doubling and tripling the noise until it seemed like the sky itself was breaking. The ground shook. Babies cried. The very stones of the Hagia Sophia hummed with the vibration, and the walls began to crack. Not immediately. The Theodosian walls were extraordinarily well built, but each day, section by section, the cannon's massive stone balls found their mark. Chunks of masonry fell away. Towers that had stood for 1,000 years cracked along their foundations. The defenders worked frantically through the night to repair the breaches, filling gaps with rubble, wooden beams, earth-filled barrels, so that each morning's bombardment would find the walls patched rather than open. It was exhausting, demoralizing work, and it continued for weeks. Mehmed tried other approaches too. He sent ships to attack the sea walls. The iron chain held. He tried to tunnel under the walls. The defenders countermined, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman sappers underground. He tried assaults up scaling ladders at night. The defenders repelled them, but the cannon kept firing, and the walls kept cracking. Then, on April 22nd, Mehmed did something that seemed impossible. The Golden Horn, the harbor inlet protected by the Byzantines' iron chain, was completely closed to Ottoman ships. So Mehmed moved his ships overland. He had his engineers construct a greased wooden track along the hills north of the Golden Horn, and during a single night, 70 or more Ottoman ships were hauled out of the Bosphorus, dragged up and over the hill on rollers, and relaunched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. The Byzantines woke up the next morning to find Ottoman warships floating in their supposedly secure harbor. The sea walls, which had been lightly defended because everyone assumed the chain made them safe, were now under threat. The harbor that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years was compromised. Justiniani and Constantine responded by finning their land wall defenders to cover the sea walls too. Soldiers who had been fighting for weeks with little sleep were now stretched even further across longer defenses. The weeks wore on. May came, mild and green. Inside Constantinople, the mood had shifted from fear to a kind of quiet desperation. Priests processed through the streets with icons, praying for a miracle. There were rumors that Venetian ships were coming with relief forces. The rumors were false, but people clung to them. Constantine XI moved through the city visiting the walls, speaking to the defenders personally, his calm presence the thing holding everything together. Outside the walls, Mehmed was growing impatient. His advisors urged him to negotiate, to offer generous terms and take the city bloodlessly. The campaign was expensive. The army had been in the field for weeks. Perhaps, they suggested, a negotiated surrender was better than an endless siege. Mehmed sent an offer to Constantine. Surrender the city. Leave peacefully with your people and your treasures. The citizens of Constantinople will not be harmed. Constantine called a council. The proposal was serious. It would save lives. It would preserve the city's people and their freedom. But it would mean the end of Rome, the end of 1,000 years of empire. The city that Constantine the Great had built as the new center of civilization surrendered without a fight. Constantine refused. His reply to Mehmed was quiet and almost formal. He was willing to surrender anything, his own wealth, his treasures, his territories. But the city itself was not his to give. It belonged to its people and to God. He would defend it until the end. Mehmed received the answer and made his decision. There would be a final assault, and it would come soon. On the evening of May 28, 1453, the Ottoman drums began to beat. Inside Constantinople, people could hear them. Through the walls, through the stone, through the silence of a city holding its breath. On one side of those ancient walls stood a 21-year-old sultan with an army of 100,000 men, the largest cannon the world had ever seen, and a destiny he had been preparing for his entire life. On the other side stood a dying empire, 7,000 exhausted defenders, crumbling walls, and the weight of 1,000 years of history. Before dawn, everything would be decided. What happened next is something you are not going to forget. Part 2 is coming.